Good afternoon, everyone, and happy early Thanksgiving. The topic of our training today is formal procurement. So we're going to discuss in detail how to use the formal procurement method for procuring both goods and services. And before we get started, I've had a lot of questions about procuring services and when SFAs are getting findings on their administrative review for not procuring a service. The state does not require the procurement of services, but USDA regulations require it. So you must procure all services in the same way that you procure your goods. So let's get started. Before we select what method we're going to use for a formal procurement, USDA regulations say that we have to do a cost price analysis. And a lot of people get real intimidated by a cost price analysis, but it really is just a historical, it's just a history of how you procured and the dollar value of your procurement during the last procurement period. So you can use like a velocity report or any type of historical data that gives an estimated price of what the procurement is going to have as a value. Without that, you can't determine which method you have to use. So make sure that you conduct that cost price analysis. You can ask your vendor, your present vendor, for a velocity report for the prior year. So just remember that every procurement that's going to estimated to be over the $60,000 small purchase threshold has to have a cost estimate. So then you have to decide whether you want to do an invitation for bid or whether you want to do a request for proposal. So an IFB, or competitive proposal, is a lot easier than doing an RFP typically. IFBs are publicly solicited and you obtain a firm fixed price contract. There may be one contract awarded to the most responsible and responsive bidder with the overall lease price, or you can do what I call an item by item award, where you award each item to whomever was low bidder. Just make sure that whichever method you're going to use, either bottom line or if you're going to award item by item, make sure you specify that in your bid. So you typically use an IFB when you have a complete set of specifications of products or services, and there are two or more responsible bidders that are willing to respond and offer you a firm fixed price. So we said that you could award bids on a lump sum price to one bidder or a line item award based on the unit prices. The key is that bids must be awarded to the responsible bidder whose bid, conforming with all the material terms and conditions of the IFB, is the lowest in price. And you would typically use an IFB when you have, again, those complete realistic specifications for purchase or detailed purchase descriptions, and you have two or more bidders who you think are willing to respond. So let's look then at an RFP, or what they can also call a competitive proposal. When you use an RFP or competitive proposal, you use both technical and cost factors in order to make the final determination for the purchase of goods and services. the results either in a award of a fixed price or a cost reimbursable contract. Competitive proposals are conducted with more than one source submitting an offer. And it's generally used when conditions are not appropriate for the use of a sealed bid. There are requirements that apply for an RFP. When you're using an RFP, your proposals must be solicited from an adequate number of qualified sources, and the SFA has to have a written method for conducting technical evaluations of the proposal. So in other words, you have to have some sort of scoring system that you're going to use, and you have to let each of the vendors know what that scoring is going to be based on when you let the RFP. Contracts have to be awarded to the responsible firm whose proposal is most advantageous to the program, with both price and other factors considered. So you might use an RFP for a qualifications-based procurement of professional services, where you would evaluate the competitor's qualifications and then select the most qualified competitor. So an example where you might use an RFP would be pest control services, consulting services, and commodity processing. Consulting services have been somewhat of an issue on administrative reviews because many of them, or most of them, are under the small purchase threshold, but because you can't use the micro purchase threshold because you're doing more than one purchase in a year, you would have to use the small purchase method for that. And with that, you would need to provide documentation to either USDA or to the state agency that the consulting services contract was procured correctly. So I know we've talked a lot over the years about the provisions for formal contracts, but we're still finding some that don't include everything. We've seen on administrative reviews that, and I know it's different right now because it's hard to get any food, much less domestically grown. But you have to make your best effort to make sure that your agricultural products, your unprocessed agricultural products, are locally grown and processed. If you are not going to be able to buy a domestic product, then your vendor would need to let you know and complete a Buy American certification form for the products that they're not able to give domestically. And then you have to do some research and make sure that what they're telling you is accurate, and that and then approve and maintain on file the Buy American certification form of your approval of those products. And I hear a lot, well, 14 days is not a lot of notice, not a lot of time for providing notice, because it could happen, tomorrow, where domestic tomatoes are not able to be found. But so I would work with my distributor on how to estimate which products that they might not be able to get domestically, so that you can get that 14 days. That's a USDA requirement. It's not something that we can change. So you've all seen the Buy American certification form. And when you use the Buy American certification form, you have to make sure that if you're saying that the cost that the product is produced or manufactured in the U.S. in sufficient and reasonable quantities, that has to be checked. If you're saying the cost of the product is significantly higher than the non-domestic, then you would need to provide that, they would need to provide the price of the domestic and the non-domestic. So by completing and signing the Buy American certification form, they're certifying again that the product is not produced or manufactured in the U.S. in sufficient and reasonable available quantities or satisfactory quality, which of course right now a good example of that is lettuce. And with the drought and the virus that's attacked the lettuce crop, it may very well be many can't get lettuce at all and are having difficulty getting the U.S. product as well. So when you have to look at to determine whether the vendor is giving you accurate information concerning the Buy American, you do have to do some research, and this is a screenshot of the Agriculture Marketing Service website, and I looked up peaches. Now this slide is a couple of years old, but on that particular day in April, peaches were only available from Chile. There didn't say anything anything about American grown. This is also an old slide, but you can always to determine what is typically available domestically grown. You can also look at the fact sheets from USDA as to what foods they're providing that are domestic, because since they can only grow domestic foods, it gives you a good idea of what is available domestically. And remember that the Buy American provision only refers to the creditable food component that is the agricultural commodity. All 5 components have to be American grown, and foods from Guam, American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and the Northern Mariana Islands are considered to be domestic. Now, when we first started the Buy American provision, probably back in 2012 or 2013, all the SFAs were highly upset because they couldn't find an American grown spice. And pretty much I have found out that there are no American grown spices. So, but that is not a creditable food item. So it is not included in the Buy American provision. One additional piece to note before moving to the award process is the geographic preference that is found in 7 CFR Part 210.21. Geographic preference is an additional scoring or evaluation criteria that can be used to provide a preference for the purchase of locally raised and agricultural products. And you know that USDA has such a push for purchasing local. That you may want to use this in if you're doing an RFP, it can be one of your evaluation factors. So again, you can apply geographic preference when you're procuring unprocessed, locally grown, or locally raised agricultural products. But when you're using the geographic preference to procure those products, you have to make sure that the purchase make sure that you determine the local area to which the geographic preference will be applied, and that needs to be in your procurement document. 2 CFR 200 doesn't allow geographic preference in the evaluation of bids or proposals, except for unprocessed, locally grown, or locally raised agricultural products. And there is no definition of local. So you have to decide what you consider to be local. And remember that this provision only applies to those agricultural products that retain their inherent character. 7 CFR 210-21 provides the specifics as to what food handling and preservation techniques that do not change the character of the product. Things like cooling or freezing or peeling or slicing or dicing. Those do not change the inherent character of a product. Even the pasteurization of milk does not change the inherent character of the product. But flavoring of milk is not included in the geographic preference. And so it can't be used when awarding a bid for flavored milk. And let me caution you, because there are several of the milk vendors, when they submit a bid, try to get the SFA to give them the geographic preference. And you could do that for unflavored milk, but I would not think that any SFA would want to purchase unflavored milk from one vendor and flavored milk from another. So my recommendation is just always to leave the geographic preference out, and don't let the milk companies tell you that you can award a geographic preference. You really have to have detailed product descriptions or product specifications, and they're so time consuming and so involved. Remember, you only have to do it one time typically, unless you're not happy with the product that you have. So make sure that when you write your product specifications that you're very descriptive about what you want, so that you can be assured that you're going to get the product that you wanted. So the first step is be very specific. You want to name the product. Be specific is to assist the vendor with understanding the product that you want. Make sure you have researched quality indicators. You may also want to obtain samples and taste test the product before adding it to your solicitation. In addition, to naming the product, if you have a code number, that's great. You want to make sure you include the pack size, the case pack, and weight. How do you want the item packaged, and how big are the cases? Include the maximum weight if that's something that you desire. Many kitchens don't have men and have older ladies that are in the kitchen working. You don't want to give them a 50-pound bag of flour to pick up and hurt their back. So you may want to state that a case shouldn't exceed 20 pounds. You also want to include the minimum and maximum size of the product itself. An example of this would be stating that a chicken nugget chicken nuggets would have to be a 3.9 ounce portion to a 4.1 ounce portion. You just have to be careful, because when you're giving minimum and maximum serving sizes, it can skew your portion cost. You may want to include the main ingredients. An example might be for a bean burrito, where the main ingredients that you want is pinto beans or black beans or whole grain tortilla. The description could include other product ingredients that you desire. What about prohibited ingredients? Things like MSG, pork, fish byproducts, soy, or food coloring. What are the nutritional standards for this product? Is there a minimum or maximum number of calories and sodium? Does the specification state that there can be no trans fat? Remember that we can't have trans fat in the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program. So your specification you would want to include that. Some other things you might want to include is the meal pattern requirements, child nutrition label information. Things like, I want the portion to include 2 meat alternates and 1 bread grain. You may want to include the unit on which the award is made, quality indicators, and then, of course, if appropriate, the Buy American provision. This is an example of a detailed product specification. This SFA wants an unbaked, frozen, lower sodium biscuit. The product must be made with enriched flour, and the enriched flour must be, the first ingredient must be enriched flour. The biscuit is not to be split. It has to be at least 2.2 ounces in weight and no more than 225 calories, 10 grams of fat, 0 trans fat, and 400 milligrams of sodium. This specification also says that it must provide 2-ounce equivalents of grain for the child nutrition program. And since grain is an agricultural product, then you want to make sure that it meets the Buy American provision. And this is just a reminder that state statute requires that all public schools, and that includes charter schools, post their bid to an electronic bid platform. Any special conditions or requirements for the submission must be specified in the advertisement for bids. So let's talk about using a fixed price contract, which is most contracts that I see in Louisiana are fixed price contracts. The bids are all received sealed and held until the time and date of the bid opening. The bids are opened publicly. In other words, the vendors are allowed to come and see the bid opening, and then they are read aloud to all participants. Then a firm fixed price contract is awarded to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. When it's specified in the bid documents, factors such as discounts, transportation costs must be considered when determining which bid is the lowest. Payment discounts will only be used to determine the low bid when prior experience indicates that such discounts are usually taken advantage of. In other words, you can't use, your first 5 orders are going to receive a discount of X as the bid price. You have to use the normal bid price. I very seldom see cost reimbursable contracts, although they are becoming more popular as the cost of food has risen so much, and many wholesalers have not been willing to do a firm fixed price contract. But if you do a cost reimbursable contract, it has 2 parts. There isn't a bid opening for a cost reimbursable contract because the price is not the only factor. So the evaluation is going to include reviewing the best technical responses according to the evaluation criteria. And the SFA has to be able to provide a detailed explanation for each evaluation score and be able to defend this to the state agency and or to USDA. The second part of the evaluation is the review of price. And price still must be a prime consideration in scoring. With RFPs, you first have to identify the evaluation factors, and you also have to weight them. You have to determine what is their relative importance in your solicitation. How is each factor going to be scored, and what specifically warrants one score from another? Evaluators must be knowledgeable in the areas that are being reviewed, as well as being knowledgeable in the scoring process. Again, the SFA must provide detailed, documented justification for scoring. The state agency or USDA should be able to review the bid documents and come up with the exact same score that you came up to. If that can't be done, then you're not being specific enough with your scoring criteria. Awarding and executing the contract. Once the evaluated, the contract is awarded and the contract is executed. This may be an official signing of the contract that includes a meeting where you provide clarification and expectations to the prospective vendor, as well as to answer the vendor's questions. Remember that contracts for food service management companies require prior approval by the state agency before you can award it. Remember that the SFA can reject any and all bids for just cause. You maintain documentation of a repeated failure of the vendor despite repeated communication. And as I say all the time, don't send a bid request to a vendor that you do not consider to be responsible and responsive. This bears repeating because you do have to make sure that you manage the contract. The contract itself is not the real work. Managing the contract is the real work, because you have to maintain oversight to make sure that the contractor is performing in accordance with the terms, conditions, and specifications of the contract. You need to make sure that you have on file the independent price determination that you've signed, suspension and debarment certification from the company, and the lobbying certification from the company. And when you're managing the contract, make sure that you check the invoices. We have found many examples on administrative reviews where the invoice price does not match the price quote. Make sure you communicate with your vendor. You may want to have an advisory committee that works with you. Make sure you have the Buy American certification form on anything that's not domestic, and make sure that you manage substitutions. Substitutions are tricky, but they're happening every day right now in this climate of where we are in such a state with being able to purchase food. So watch your substitutions. If you're using processing contracts, you make sure those have to be managed as well. You have to make sure that there's a reconciliation, that the correct price is on the invoice, and that you're monitoring the processor's performance. Make sure that you have an active SANS number on each of the vendors you use. They have to be active in SANS in order to do business with the federal government. Let's talk for a minute about canceling a contract. Make sure that you notify the vendor by email, in writing, anytime the vendor fails to deliver in accordance with the signed contract. It should indicate how the problem needs to be corrected, and you have to make sure you maintain records of the date that you informed them and also the information discussed. If the problem is not resolved, the SFA has to give the vendor written notification of the problem, indicating that immediate correction is expected and that failure to do so will be considered a breach of contract and could result in the cancellation of the contract. If cancellation of the contract becomes necessary, the SFA has to provide written notification of the proposed action to the vendor, the reasons for the proposed action, and even if the contract is not canceled, the SFA may disqualify the vendor from any future bidding due to poor performance. Make sure that you include language in your bid document that includes the steps that will be taken when a vendor repeatedly fails to deliver according to the contract. If you disqualify a contractor for lack of responsibility, you do have to notify them in writing and give them an opportunity for a hearing. If the SFA is rejecting a bid because of unresponsiveness, the bidder must be informed of why the bid was rejected. We talk about piggybacking all the time because it has become so complicated. If you plan to allow piggybacking, your solicitation document has to state that piggybacking is allowed. The original contract must indicate either how many SFAs are allowed to piggyback or a dollar value that will be allowed. The piggybacking SFA must have all the required documentation from the original solicitation. So we also have state regulations concerning piggybacking. The original bid has to have been compliant with state requirements. The piggybacking could not exceed 2 times the bid amount. It cannot exceed the small purchase threshold because it would create a material change, and the small purchase threshold is $60,000. And a cost price analysis has to be conducted. If you're doing a formal bid, these provisions from Appendix 2 of 2 CFR 200 must be included in your procurement document. The remedies for breach, termination for cause and convenience, the equal opportunity, and the days vacant if it's applicable. For food, it's not applicable. It also has to include contract work hours, rights to inventions, if applicable, the Clean Air Act and Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and the Bird Anti-Lobbying. It also has to include procurement of recovered materials, the minority, women, and labor surplus. And as I've said before, it's not only the language of, yes, we're going to follow the Minority, Women's, and Labor Surplus Act, You also have to show this, be able to show during an administrative review that you did seek out minority and women's vendors to reach out to them to see if they would like to bid on your contract. And there are some links in the procurement plan for the Hudson Veteran Initiative and also for the small business site to try to find minority and women's businesses. Make sure that you include all of the civil rights laws. There's the Civil Rights Act, the Education Amendment, the Rehabilitation Act, the Age Discrimination Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, and Civil Rights Compliance. All of those are required in every procurement. Okay, I've added a couple of things today because it's been findings on reviews. I really do try to always communicate when I see findings that that might be applicable to others. So hopefully they can fix them before their review. Commodity storage and delivery has been a finding on administrative reviews. Now, I'm not talking about the storage and delivery that comes from the Department of Ag, but when you are storing commodities and you're paying for storage and or delivery of those products to your schools or to your warehouse or wherever, you have to properly procure it. The only reason you don't have to do that with your commodity goods that come from Department of Agriculture, if they're coming directly to you, is because the procurement has already been done for you. A cost price analysis has to be completed in order to determine how you're going to proceed with procuring the storage and delivery. If you're going to exceed $60,000, then you have to do a formal procurement. If you're going to exceed, if you're not going to exceed the $60,000, then it would have to be a small purchase. Couldn't use a micro purchase because you're going to be paying for that on multiple invoices during the year. So make sure that you determine which method you must use and make sure you follow the procurement requirements for that method. And you can always find the procurement requirements in the procurement plan, the sample procurement plan. This has been a finding of late for charter schools where the reviewers are not able to obtain a reconciliation of commodities when the school is using a food service management company. And the food service management company has to credit the SFA for the value of all donated foods received for meal service in the school year or in the fiscal year, but most people use the school year. Crediting by the food service management company has to be very clear, and it must provide documentation of the value of all foods received and show the credits that were given to the SFA. And at the end of the year, those should be zero. So watch those. Like I said, that's been a finding. That concludes our training for today. If we have any questions, please see. Put any questions you had. No, an RFP bid opening does not have to be public because there wouldn't be any point since you're using both price and other factors. The companies aren't privy to your evaluation of the other factors. So there is no point in, like the cost may only be 30% of your of your evaluation factors. And so just because you're low bidder does not mean you're going to get the bid award. On the piggybacking, does the 2 times the original value of the bid pertain to each SFA that piggybacks or the total? And it's the total. If you publicly advertise a bid, what else do you do to document the inclusion of women and minorities in the bid process? I always recommend that SFAs look up the Hudson list and the veterans list. And you can actually, with the Hudson list, you can actually save that to your desktop. I mean, it's very inclusive, so you wouldn't want to print it out on paper. But usually if a reviewer comes in and says, well, what did you do? You need to be able to say, okay, I have the Hudson list right here, and I check it to make sure there are, to see if there's women or minorities businesses. And then you can also just have just know and check the Small Business Association list. It's hugely massive, and so you wouldn't want to download that to your computer. But usually just the answer of what you did, and you could even put it in your contract or in your proposal document that you're going to consult the Hudson list and you're going to consult the Small Business Association list. Is there any more questions? Doesn't look like there's any more questions. So you consult these lists, then send the bid to these individuals? Absolutely. Send them to the individuals if you can find somebody on that list. I'm always looking out for, when I talk to different vendors, I'm always looking out for minority vendors and asking them to go and apply for the Hudson list so that they'd be available for any of our SFAs that would like to use them. But yes, I would send it just like you send to, you send your bid to the companies that you think would usually bid, send it to them as well. And that's your proof that you sought a minority or women-owned business. Well, always know that if you have additional questions, our telephone number is here. You can reach us at the office, and anyone there will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Y'all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know y'all are going to enjoy your week off next week. Goodbye.